13-year wrongful conviction in Texas overturned, and the tragic truth behind it. Hello. Around 10 a.m. on October 24, 1988, Todd DePriest, a resident of Austin, Texas, was at work when he received an urgent phone call. On the other end of the line was a distressed man named Billy Brown who said, "I'm sorry, but your wife has been taken away in an ambulance after an attack at the restaurant. I don't know her condition right now. Please go to the hospital immediately." Todd's wife, Nancy DePriest, was working at a well-known pizza chain, Pizza Hut, and Billy, the caller, was her manager. Rushing to the hospital, Todd found Nancy in the emergency room, while Billy was waiting outside the operating room and recounted what had happened. At that time, Pizza Hut did not serve breakfast, so the store typically opened around 10:30 a.m., but each morning, an employee arrived at 7 a.m. to prepare. October 24, 1988, was Nancy's early shift. At around 8 a.m., Billy called the store to check in on her work, but after 3 unanswered calls, he grew concerned. Billy assumed that, as a newer employee, Nancy might be too busy to pick up the phone, so he decided to visit the store to lend a hand. Arriving at about 9:30 a.m., Billy found the store empty. Nancy was nowhere in sight. As he investigated further, he discovered her unconscious on the restroom floor. She was not only disheveled, but had one hand tied to a pipe in the restroom. More disturbingly, she had suffered a life-threatening injury to the back of her head. Billy immediately called the police and requested an ambulance to rush Nancy to the hospital. As Billy recounted the details, Todd struggled to accept the situation. Nancy was only 20 years old, and they had a 15-month-old daughter, making this trauma all the more devastating. And the nightmare wasn't over. Doctors informed Todd that Nancy had slipped into a deep coma with little chance of survival. Meanwhile, the police were investigating the crime scene at Pizza Hut. A close inspection led to several important clues. 1. The store had not yet opened when the attack occurred, and there was no sign of forced entry. This implied that the perpetrator might have been allowed in by Nancy or had a key. 2. All the cash from the register and the safe was missing. 3 .2 .2 shell casing was found on the restroom floor. 4. Nancy's disheveled state indicated a high likelihood of sexual assault. Based on these clues, the police's first suspect was Billy, the store manager. As the person who discovered the scene and reported the incident, Billy naturally warranted scrutiny. Additionally, Billy had access to the store and the safe, and he knew Nancy would be alone that morning. What troubled the investigators most was the apparent intent behind the attack. Given her small stature, Nancy would have posed little threat, so why would the assailant resort to such extreme measures if robbery alone was the goal? This led detectives to believe that Nancy might have known her attacker. Detective Hector Polanco, assigned to the case, escorted Billy from the hospital to the police station for questioning. However, they soon discovered that Billy had an alibi, backed by witnesses, proving he was not at the scene when the crime occurred, and he was quickly cleared as a suspect. Next, Hector questioned Todd and Nancy's mother, Janet Pope, hoping to uncover any details about Nancy's personal life that could aid the investigation. Both affirmed that Nancy's life was straightforward, especially after the birth of their daughter. Her routine revolved around work and caring for her family, with nothing out of the ordinary to suspect. As the case hit a dead end, police hoped for a miracle, that Nancy might regain consciousness and identify her attacker. But that miracle never came. Just hours after being admitted, Nancy passed away in the emergency room, leaving her family and the investigators in shock. However, the hospital provided a critical clue. Tests revealed traces of semen, confirming that Nancy had been sexually assaulted. Yet, without Nancy's account, the investigation faced a serious setback. If, as suspected, Nancy's attacker was someone she knew, it would be significant. If it was a random assault, the case would be far harder to solve. Detective Hector dispatched officers back to the scene for a second, more exhaustive search, determined to leave no stone unturned. This time, they found a brown hair on the scene, but without a known suspect, the hair had limited value. As a high-profile restaurant chain, Pizza Hut could not keep the incident out of the media spotlight for long, and soon the case drew widespread public attention, placing intense pressure on the police. Detective Hector remained composed. Noting the public's growing interest, he announced a reward for information, hoping someone might come forward. Unfortunately, since the restaurant was closed during the attack, most of the tips received were of little value. Just as the investigation seemed to be faltering, however, an unexpected breakthrough came to light. Unexpected breakthrough. In early November 1988, roughly 2 weeks after the incident, the police received a call from the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked. The caller, a waitress, reported an unusual interaction. 2 men came in for a meal, ordered pizza and 2 beers, and at first everything seemed normal. But as soon as I left their table, I overheard them mentioning the name Nancy DePriest, followed by the clinking of their beer bottles. The waitress explained that Nancy didn't know these men. She remembered them from a staff training at another Pizza Hut, and Nancy hadn't started her job there at the time. The police quickly identified the men as Chris Ochoa, 22, and Richard Danzig, 19, both Pizza Hut employees. When questioned separately, Chris and Richard provided identical statements, insisting they didn't know Nancy. They claimed to have been merely curious about her due to recent news reports about the tragic case, as they happened to dine at the store where she worked. On the morning of the murder, Chris said he had breakfast at home, while Richard stated he was at home with his girlfriend, Donna Anstead. Although their alibis seemed plausible, neither provided a solid account to prove their absence from the crime scene. Determined to uncover any inconsistencies, detectives decided to press Richard further. Since Donna could potentially verify his alibi, they hoped to use her testimony as leverage. When Donna arrived for questioning, she confirmed Richard was indeed home with her, but police suspicion grew after her polygraph test results indicated deception. Surprisingly, Chris was the first to crack under pressure. After 2 days of intense interrogation, he appeared ready to confess. Seizing the moment, Detective Hector offered him a plea deal, and fearing a death sentence, 22-year-old Chris decided to reveal everything. Chris confessed that on the night of October 23, 1988, he and Richard had shared a few drinks at Richard's place. During their conversation, Chris lamented his recent financial struggles. This led them to a plan to rob a Pizza Hut. They had access to a master key, and as employees, they knew the best time to act and where the money would be stored. On October 24th, early in the morning, they drove to Nancy's store, choosing it for its proximity to their workplace. They parked nearby, observing the store to ensure Nancy was alone. When they confirmed she was, they sneaked in through the back entrance using the key. Armed with a gun, Chris confronted Nancy and demanded she open the safe and register. Seeing the loaded weapon, Nancy panicked and complied. Their original intent was to take the money and leave, but things escalated. Chris, noticing Nancy's beauty, decided to take things further, believing they had enough time. He dragged her to the restroom, and what happened next is easily inferred. Afterward, Chris shot Nancy, explaining that as fellow Pizza Hut employees, he couldn't risk her identifying them. Though Chris's confession seemed thorough, the police faced challenges verifying it. The murder weapon had been disassembled and disposed of in a canal, making it impossible to match it with the casing found at the scene. Further complicating matters, Richard maintained his innocence steadfastly, despite Chris's confession. With no conclusive physical evidence against him, Richard's unwavering denial left detectives at an impasse. The police then remembered the DNA evidence they had collected. Though forensic DNA testing was primitive in 1988, they sent the sample to Edward Black, the lead examiner at the local forensic association. He used the DQ alpha method, a relatively new technique, and found an 84% match between the sample from Nancy and Chris's DNA. While not definitive, this match strongly suggested Chris as the prime suspect. Despite this, Richard's adamant denial continued to stall the case. But then investigators re-examined a hair sample found at the scene, and under the microscope, its color, thickness, and structure bore a striking resemblance to Richard's hair. This piece of evidence, though seemingly minor, proved essential in linking him to the crime. In January 1990, nearly 2 years after the crime, the trial for Chris and Richard began. Throughout the proceedings, each defendant maintained his stance. Chris cooperated and described their involvement in the crime, while Richard insisted on his innocence. However, with the police's persuasive evidence, both men were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. As the two entered prison, Nancy's case slowly faded from the public eye. But 3 years after the sentencing, an incident occurred that stirred things up again. Richard got into a prison altercation, resulting in severe brain swelling. He underwent critical brain surgery, leaving him unable to care for himself, needing assistance with basic tasks, and suffering from intense seizures. Despite his tragic state, many people believed it was a fitting consequence for his actions. Over time, however, this story faded from public memory. Yet, in an unexpected twist, the case returned to public attention 10 years later, spurred by an unusual event. In February 1998, the Texas governor received a peculiar letter from Asim Joseph Marino, a man serving time for robbery. The content was even stranger. Asim requested the governor to release Chris and Richard, the convicted men in Nancy's case, claiming they were innocent. Asim revealed in the letter that he was the true perpetrator of the crime. After converting to Christianity in prison, he felt compelled to confess, no longer wanting innocent people to suffer for his actions. Before the governor could make a decision, however, the letter caught the attention of the press. The story was quickly picked up, igniting public curiosity and sparking rumors. In response, the governor assigned Detective Manuel Fuente to investigate Asim's claims. Manuel devised a clear plan to verify Asim's confession. Among the evidence police had collected, only the bullet casing could definitively trace the murder weapon, though the .22 caliber gun itself was never found. To confirm Asim's confession, he would need to provide the weapon he claimed to have used. Manuel promptly met with Asim in prison. Asim explained that the gun had been confiscated during a robbery and was with the police. Manuel requested the weapon be retrieved and tested against the bullet casing from the crime scene. The results showed that the gun did not match the casing. Manuel wasn't surprised, as he had encountered similar situations where inmates fabricated confessions for various reasons. With the case seemingly at a dead end, Nancy's case once again slipped into obscurity. 2 years later, in 2000, the governor received another letter from Asim. This time, however, Asim sent copies to both the governor and the local district attorney. Detective Manuel was assigned the investigation once more. This time, he took a different approach. Rather than speaking to Asim, he went directly to Chris, aiming to discern any additional details. If Chris continued to claim guilt, the case could be laid to rest. However, if he expressed doubt, further investigation would be warranted. When Manuel met Chris, he asked directly, "Are you the real culprit in Nancy's case? Are you sure you didn't lie to the police?" "I am the perpetrator. I did not lie," Chris replied. After receiving this answer, Manuel filed a report and the case seemed finally closed. A year later, in 2001, a Wisconsin organization dedicated to addressing wrongful convictions, known as the Honor Restoration Program, received a handwritten letter. While one might expect the letter to be from Asim, it was actually from Chris. In his letter, Chris alleged that he had been coerced 12 years prior. During his interrogation, the lead investigator, Hector, had shown Chris pictures of notorious criminals, threatening him with a similar fate if he didn't confess. Terrified of receiving a severe sentence, Chris agreed to the plea deal and took the blame for a crime he hadn't committed. But why didn't Chris reveal the truth to Detective Manuel a year prior? Chris explained that his past experiences had left him deeply distrustful of investigators, which had prevented him from sharing the truth at that time. When John Pullen, head of the Honor Restoration Program, received Chris's letter, he was deeply intrigued by the case. Driven by his interest, he immediately reached out to Chris's former defense attorney for additional information that could help Chris. Surprisingly, the attorney was unconvinced of Chris's innocence and even warned John, saying, "Don't trust Chris. He's the real culprit. The DNA comparison has already been done." Despite the lawyer's words, John decided to investigate further. Upon reviewing the original DNA comparison, he uncovered a critical flaw. The police had used outdated DQ-alpha DNA technology, which by 2001 had been vastly improved. Determined to pursue the truth, John arranged for a new DNA comparison for Chris. When the new results arrived, the entire Honor Restoration team was shocked. Chris had been wrongfully convicted. His DNA did not match the perpetrators. Driven to uncover the real culprit, John collected DNA from another suspect and ran a second comparison. This time, it was a perfect match. Asim Joseph Marino was identified as the true perpetrator. John promptly presented these findings to Detective Manuel and urged him to reopen the case. After reviewing the report, Manuel obtained a search warrant for Asim's residence. During the search, the police found a second .22 caliber firearm. Upon testing, it matched the shell casing found at Nancy's crime scene. With this evidence, Chris and Richard were finally exonerated. Chris was released on January 16, 2001, and Richard followed on March 22nd. On February 6, 2002, 14 years after Nancy's tragic death, both men were officially declared innocent and released. They then sought compensation for their wrongful imprisonment, with Chris receiving $5 million and Richard, who suffered severe injuries in prison, awarded $11 million. This case spurred legislative changes in Texas, with a new law mandating that law enforcement record all interrogations to ensure fairness and transparency in the justice system. Had investigator Hector not succumbed to public pressure and coerced a confession from Chris, both men might have avoided years of wrongful imprisonment, and Richard might not have suffered his tragic injuries. Although Nancy's life was unjustly taken, leaving behind a grieving family, justice was ultimately served thanks to the true perpetrator's confession. And that concludes our story for today. Share your thoughts below for discussion. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.